What's up, football fans? It's over. The 2025 NFL draft. I'm so sad. However, now we get to start the next stage of fun stuff, and that is talk about the different fits and how people fit on the different teams and how the teams are going to be better as a result of the players that they just added to their roster via the draft. They never stops, Sam. All of the NFL analysis. It's just a year-long cycle.
Lindsay, it made me laugh because I got a lot of engagement on my Instagram story, which was basically a day-by-day catch-up of how I looked moving forth from, pick 32 to pick 2 whatever, and then finally the final pick of the draft. And, day 1, I was looking great. We had our suits and ties and dress wear on. We were in a studio. Day 2, I was drinking an egg cream at a diner at like 1 a.m. because the draft had just gone off. And day 3,
you were doing what? You were drinking what?
Are you not familiar with the egg cream, Lindsay?
Absolutely not.
We may have to bring Stofsky in for this one. Stofsky, I'm calling you in. This is a cultural moment that we're having right now. Stofsky, explain the egg cream to Lindsay, please.
Oh, I'm not the right person to bring us in for. I had my first egg cream only like a few years ago, Sam.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, but it's delicious. It's like a New York diner staple. So
what is it? What I like paint.
So
it
has no. Stofsky, so long, brother. I thought you were gonna help me out, but he didn't help me out. So the egg cream is notorious to like it's served at like Cat's Delicatessen and Second Avenue Deli and like basically all it is chocolate milk with seltzer in it, like CO2, like carbonation. And so it has neither egg nor cream, but it's just like a deli special that you can only get at like delis and diners in New York City. It's something I like. It's a little watered down and it does have bubbles and chocolate syrup in it, but it's a tasty beverage, especially after the draft on day 2.
Comp? What is it? Let's continue our draft like conversation. What is the comp for an egg cream?
I mean, I think the egg cream. Okay, so I'm going to have to go down the list of things. It has to fit at the right time. It also is like, it's not the first pick in the draft by any means. Like you're probably wanting like a chocolate shake if you're like really going all in on like pure value. So I have to say like the Josh Connerly, Josh Simmons was the egg cream of this draft. Like just perfectly at the right time to the right team, hit the spot. And you just like to see it happen. So congratulations, Josh Connerly, who we'll get to in a second, and Josh Simmons. You are the 2025 Sam Bruchhaus Egg Cream of the Draft award.
Oh, we're gonna have to keep that going for years to come. And in like 2028, somebody will be the egg cream of the draft, and people will be like, "What the frick are they talking about?" By the way, I changed that to frick for like your grandmother who listens to the
Shout
pod.
out, Granny.
Now I'm self-conscious about me talking the way that I actually talk. So I'm Lindsay Rhodes. This is Sam Bruchhaus. We're 3.5 minutes into the show. I'm going to introduce us. Welcome to the SumerSports show post-draft. We are going to go through our draft weekend winners. I guess it's like draft day winners is what the title of this episode is, but it's really like 3 days worth of draft winners. So we're going to talk about the teams. We're big process people, right? That's the way we approach the whole draft buildup. What will they do? What should they do? All of that kind of stuff. You want to max value. You want to take into consideration opportunity cost. In a perfect world, you want to fill the needs and make your roster better in whatever way that looks like, while also maxing value in the draft. It's like a fun game that we like to play. So we're going to go through the teams that we think did that best and maybe highlight some players that we think that fans of specific teams should have on their radar and maybe be excited about, right? Like everybody is familiar with the like, hey, our team just drafted this guy in the 5th round. Who the heck is that? And so we have some reasons for you to get excited about some of those various picks. By the way, this is notably not our draft grades episode because Sam and I not fans.
Yeah, here's the reason why I'm not a fan of draft grades, because okay, we put grades on players pre-draft so that we can figure out where they will go in the draft and how teams value them. And so teams can build their board. So that makes sense. It has an end goal. What is the end goal of a draft grade after the draft? Like to be wrong when the season starts? Like there's no way to understand the context that will change during training camp it's so difficult to figure out like how the players will interact with one another, will interact with the team that they're going to. And then like, there's just no, like the grades will come in 3 years. Like enjoy them then. Like go write the 4,000 word article at that point. Like I just don't love the draft grades because it implies that you know which players are good, which I distinctly do not like doing so, other than for the reason of parsing out where they're going to go in the draft, or if I were on a team, parsing out how they would fit on my team.
Yeah, the evaluation is fun in the build up to the draft, trying to figure out the game. Now, clearly the teams have weighed in a way that suggests that maybe in some cases their evaluation is different than ours. There is absolutely no way at this point in time to say my evaluation is better than your evaluation. Or else we wouldn't have this conversation every year in the buildup to the draft about how nobody actually knows anything and we get this wrong constantly, right? Like teams are going to have drafted people in the first round that we're all on board with right this second that are going to be busts.
Right.
Teams are going to draft people in the 5th and 6th and maybe even 7th rounds that are going to end up being very, very high caliber starting players for a long time. And they're not on our radar right now. So, I hate draft grades because it implies that I know more than the people who actually have their entire lives invested in this process and have come to a different conclusion than me. So that's whatever. I realize that it's not meant to be that serious, and everybody who does draft grades, it's just producing content. It's a way to like say, here's how I evaluate the draft, but it just bugs me. I don't like it. So we're not going to do it. And I'm glad that you're on board so that I'm not forced to take part in an exercise that I can't get behind. So what we're going to do here is we like keep it positive. For a lot of the reasons that I just said, like, who are we to say that, somebody just blew it by taking a guy that they like that we don't necessarily like as much. So we're going to highlight the ones that we absolutely like. So I know that you've come up with a list of like, by the way, sidebar, you talked about how you were getting a lot of feedback about like how your look evolved over the weekend and maybe got progressively more tired looking. Right now, you look like a man who's had a few days to just kind of like relax after.
Yeah.
Like you look freshly showered and the hair is dapper and our shirts kind of match to a degree. But so anyway, I just want to point out that you look well rested, which is
I appreciate it. I got a little as followers of this podcast know, I love music. Like that's my favorite thing on earth. I got a little MJ Linderman concert in me yesterday. It's fantastic. Got some good music. Got some good rest. I'm unfamiliar with
MJ Linderman too.
MJ Linderman is a alt country artist from Asheville, North Carolina, who I learned is like massive. I saw him 3 years ago, basically in someone's apartment, a little place in Bushwick called Market Hotel, which is like literally an apartment unit with maybe 200 other people. And then he played one of the biggest venues in Brooklyn yesterday with thousands of people. Also, like a lot of dads, a lot of moms too. It was a very wide distribution of age. There were a lot of.
How do you know someone's a dad unless they have their kid in tow?
Well, that's what I was about to get into. It was a 16 and up concert, even though it was because it's a venue, it's not a bar. And so there was obviously at the last time I went, it was people between the age of 21 and maybe 30 at the highest. Mm-hmm. And this time there was a substantial increase in the distribution of people over the age of 50 and their kids who were between like 16 and 20 maybe, or 16 and 18. And so it was a very different crowd, but nonetheless fun.
All right. So there's there are multiple sidebars on top of our main thing. Let's get back to the main thing. Make the main thing the main thing, and that is the draft winners. Your top 3 in order. Should we count backwards? Should we start at 3 and build up to 1, or do you want to go like 1 to 3 and really start with the thing that you're the most passionate about? Up to you.
Yeah, let's start with 3. I'm going to give a couple honorable mentions just first. I think the Giants.
So we're going to start with like 5.
Yeah, we'll do 5. I mean, we'll just like bounce back and forth on the honorable mentions because there are teams that I enjoyed what they did and I feel it deserves comment. So like the Giants, for example, the Giants remained, I don't want to use the term conservative because, the Philadelphia Eagles are quote conservative by picking players who are highly rated and then they end up being good. Like, not the most conservative thing on earth, but the Giants took a shot by trading up to get Jackson Dart. That being said, it wasn't much of a reach. I think it was like technically 16% reach in terms of, the draft capital. He was around the 25th pick in EDP. If you're considering it a reach, it was because of his slot on consensus big boards such as Arif Hassan's and Austin Mock from the Athletics.
Mm-hmm.
But I almost think you got to consider quarterbacks in a different class than the consensus big board per se. Like when we're evaluating the draft itself, when we're evaluating the players, you want to look at those gaps, which we've talked about quite a bit on this show, of like the gigantic gaps between any given quarterback. But all that being said, they get him at around his EDP, expected draft position, that is. And then they draft a bunch of players like Marcus Imbo and several other players that people were really excited about. And I think the idea that Giants fans have something to be excited about going into this year, alongside their multiple shots at quarterbacks that they're taking, including the 2 in free agency, the 1 in the draft. The trade was not by any means detrimental to the levels that we've seen these types of trades for quarterbacks at the back half of the first round be.
Not as detrimental as, say, moving up to 26.
Yeah, I mean, you said it, not me, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But I did like what the Giants did. So they're on my honorable mention list, and then I guess we can move to 3, or if you have any honorable mentions.
Wait, hold on. I want to dive into that one in a little bit more detail, not to slow us down, but because we talked about the trade up to 25. So when that was happening, you and I were kind of conversationally trying to figure this out in real time, and I think it was worth at least considering that they moved to 25 specifically because 26 was the Rams, and there was some talk about whether or not the Rams would draft their quarterback of the future to develop behind Matthew Stafford. You know, he is not long for them. We've had a lot of conversation about that. So that's why 25. And then were they going up over the Rams because they thought that the Rams might take Jackson Dart? As it turns out, I don't think that that was the correct evaluation based on the Rams' next moves. You could also argue that they were moving up there so that somebody else couldn't move up there, right? Like if you were like, hey, I think the Raiders might also be trying to move up to try and get somebody, like, it's not necessarily just getting ahead of the Rams, right? In terms of the process of going to 25, there were a lot of different reasons that they might do that. Let's figure out whether or not that was a smart move to get ahead of people. What you think that they were thinking.
So my assumption is, here's my assumption of what went into the model of the expected draft position at 25. Obviously, one was the some of the teams that needed quarterbacks, which 21 would have been the Steelers if they were interested in Jackson Dart, which they obviously didn't end up being at that selection. That made sense. I think a lot of people saw the Rams as a position for like them to take a quarterback and then sit him for a year. So there's another one. And then I think once you start getting from about 25 to about 32, you get in the zone where we've seen people just pick swap, as in like, okay, I'll grab a little bit of value in the 3rd or 4th round. And, a team that is really good, like the Eagles, will move back and still select a player that they want anyway. That we basically saw the Eagles trade up in a similar scenario to this, where they just, gave up like a 5th round pick or something like that. And it just is a lot easier to get those deals done. And so I'm of the mind that perhaps a team like the Saints, or a team you mentioned like the Raiders or someone like that,
Jets,
was probably
Browns, even at that time, we didn't know if the Browns wanted a quarterback at 33.
Yeah, perchance the Browns. I think that there was chatter around the league, and doing radio hits around, that seems to be what the local people think as well, of like there was chatter around the league that teams were trying to get to a certain position in order to draft Jackson Dart or whoever they may have wanted at that pick, uncertainty, unrelated. And I think that's why the Giants probably pulled the trigger.
So you think even though none of those teams ended up grabbing a quarterback with their next pick, this was still a move that you can co-sign? On the one hand, it might actually imply that
ended up getting Shuck, right? If I'm not mistaken. So I think the Saints were probably correct. Yeah, pick 8, round 2, pick 8, Tyler Shuck. So I'm assuming the Saints were probably the one who was making some calls, especially given their notoriety for trading up.
Okay. Or it could imply also that some of these other teams wanted Jackson Dart. And then once Jackson Dart was gone, then they just pivoted and went in a different direction. Okay. Just wanted to have that conversation about the trade. Okay. So that's one of your honorable mentions. Who else?
So otherwise on my honorable mention, and we can buzz through this one quick, is the Bucks. the Bucks like quadrupled down on their strengths. And then they also picked up a lot of guys that the folks who followed the draft year round really loved. So for example, we all loved Tess Johnson out of Oregon. They picked him late. Emeka Egbuka, people loved him. Ben Morrison, those were two like high character guys, contributors to national championship teams with various questions. Egbuka never necessarily being a wide receiver one, Morrison having some pretty stout injury concerns. And then they got kind of the draft nerd guys. David Walker out of Central Arkansas was a guy weeks and weeks and weeks ago, literally first week of Draft FM. Mike Renner said that he loved David Walker. He thought that he was actually like, he had around I hate saying a first round grade, but like he had a top grade on him as an edge rusher. He thought he was part of the top tier of edge rushers. They end up picking him in a middle round. And especially for a team who has built through multiple offensive coordinators, has since added a quarterback, kind of, I'm going to state that they got lucky, but perhaps got lucky, and then have succeeded in the middle to late rounds with guys like Bucky Irving, even Sean Tucker last year got quality snaps and ripped the Saints apart. Like they've just succeeded with middle to late round picks in recent years. It seems like that's their approach at this point as well.
It's such an interesting, it's kind of similar to what the Broncos did, where the Broncos took a position that is a strength and they made it even stronger when they added Jahdae Barron. I kind of feel like the Bucks doubled down on that. Like we have all of these weapons. I mean, and going back to last year when they added Bucky Irving. And so they've just got guys everywhere. Like we're just going to be so stacked in terms of our offensive weapons. We're going to be really, really strong and really, really deep. And I think that that's an interesting strategy. It's kind of like a collection of assets, almost like the Browns did, which is a separate conversation about, I know the analytics community likes the idea of just take lots of a position, and then the chances are of one of them hitting is stronger. So I think I'm sorry. I'm trying to. What was the comment that we just put on the screen there?
You saying the analytics community likes adding quarterbacks. Sean Donahue, long-term listeners, piping in. Baker hitting this level is lucky. The signing of Mayfield is good process. So again, like the analytics community likes taking shots on quarterbacks. Shocker.
Yeah. So I think that you could maybe say the same thing about like, we're just going to add tons of wide receivers. We're going to be good here. And then also this clearly, I think in terms of process shows that they're planning for the future. They're not just trying to put people on the field right now, because there's no doubt that there are more wide receivers than there are like more mouths to feed, to steal that phrase, than there will be balls to go around this year with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin still there. Now, if Chris Godwin, who has an injury history, gets hurt, or even Mike Evans, who's getting up there in age, then now they have guys that they can cycle through without taking a step back, but as well.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to a certain degree too, given those two guys are, a little older. But I also want to note that if you're a team that does make the playoffs, but you're in a poor division and you've made the playoffs in previous years with a not great record, you can't just act like you're a playoff team. Like you have to act the W total. Or even if you want to go even further down, like the analytical W total, rather than who you are, rather than like just making the playoffs. And I think if the Bucks take a close look at themselves, they're a playoff team because the South is pretty rough, or has been in recent years, but they're not competing to the level that they want to against teams like the Commanders, against teams like the Eagles. And so I think they've approached this draft with the idea that they're, an 8 to 9 win over under team, rather than, we're a certified playoff team and we're going to make it to the Super Bowl and we just have to add guys on the margins. Like I think they're approaching it in the proper way and trying to add really high impact players rather than just trying to fill needs, which I think is really key.
Yep. Okay. So Giants and Bucks are honorable mentions. Do we have more honorable mentions? Or are we like just rewarding everybody here? Or are we going to hit the top 3 at this point?
No more honorable mentions from me. So we'll start off with 3 here. And number 3 for me is the Los Angeles Rams. And I think they could have been number 3 if all they did was make the massive trade where they snag a first rounder and like get off of a pick.
We didn't draft anyone, but we won.
Yeah, and get off of a pick that I don't think they loved anyone a lot given the cards they were dealt. And it's not something we've seen as of late. We have not seen a pick of that value. And then talking about the same thing with the Bucks, I went and looked at their win total this year, and it was about 9.5. And so this is another team who is like teetering on making the playoffs, according to what Vegas thinks, and in a very difficult division. And so there's like some reaches in their draft, like Terrence Ferguson. I think he is a talented tight end. This is a talented tight end draft. I thought they probably could have waited to get him, but they end up picking him. I'm fine with that generally. I love the Josiah Stewart trend. What this signaled to me and why I think they were the number 3 team is that they have a plan going into the draft every single year. They execute that plan every single year.
Yeah.
The trade up and the Josiah Stewart pick are what signaled that to me this year. They love transfer up defensive linemen that have excellent production and excellent, on our side, analytical grades. They've done it 5 times now, basically 4 or 5 times now. Kobe Turner, Byron Young, Verse and Fisk. Now we add Josiah Stewart, who was at Coastal, transfers up to Michigan, is immensely productive on a very good defensive line, which was one of the question marks. Despite the size, they can add him into a defensive line that was the absolute strength of that team. They get him at good value, and it just all comes together in terms of, here is our plan. We're going to continue building this defense through young players. We're going to continue to get value in future drafts. We're going to add players that we think we like. And I think when you have a plan, you execute it rather than panicking. That's really how to be a winner of a draft, period.
Can you expound upon the point that you were making about the trade up defensive players, like what you're talking about there, or transfer up defensive players? Because there's clearly some signal in terms of something that they think that they have found here where they can identify guys. Just in case people are unfamiliar with kind of that concept. What are you talking about?
Right. So the difficulty, as you're saying, of signal is they're really the only team that seems to be doing this. I've checked other teams and I haven't noticed anyone who does this year after year after year. So it's difficult to say there's signal in these players just being like good in the NFL, but they seem to believe
there's signal in their pattern.
Exactly.
I think. Yeah.
Exactly. They seem to believe, basically since the start of the transfer portal 2 to 3 years ago, that if a defensive lineman who exhibits good to great athletic traits can go from a lower level, if we're talking about guys like Jared Verse, the FCS level, Albany, and then go to a Power 5 level and succeed at the same exact degree as that player succeeded at the FCS level, they seem to think that will track to the NFL level. And the 2 biggest items of this is Braden Fisk and Jared Verse. Braden Fisk transferred from, I believe it was Western Michigan to Florida State, and Jared Verse transferred from Albany to Florida State. They immediately then became All-Americans at the Power 5 level. They were All-Americans at the FCS G5 level. They immediately became All-Conference, All-American performers at the Power 5 level. They then go to the NFL and are immediately 2 of the best defensive linemen in the league, especially when it comes to pass rushers. And so the track that I think they're viewing Josiah Stewart in is Josiah Stewart was an all-conference performer, immensely effective at Coastal Carolina, Sun Belt performer, transfers up to Michigan, 2 years at Michigan, immensely productive, blew our SumerSports out of the park. Obviously, there's some size concerns. There was size concerns with Braden Fisk as well. But the assumption is that he'll come in and then immediately be able to be impactful for the NFL. Is that what's going to happen? I don't know, but they seem to have identified that as a type or stereotype of player that they want to attack in the draft.
Sean Donahue has put a question in the chat about the Rams highlighting late bloomers, which I think is maybe a different way of describing this, right? In terms of like that you can, everything that you just said sort of fits this to a degree. But I think also we've had this conversation in different stages, and I think this would be a great deep dive in the off season to go into the transfer portal and how it's changed everything in terms of draft projection. Like we've had this conversation with regards to the quarterbacks and whether or not now the process is just different than it ever has been because we have quarterbacks. The draft process is about data collection, right? And like which data points are sticky, meaning that there's something meaningful attached to these, like which stats matter, which trends matter in terms of projection, which stats have traditionally pointed us in the direction of this means this guy's likely to be successful versus this doesn't actually transfer to the NFL. And I think with the quarterbacks in particular, and I think we're describing it also at the defensive line position here, if you have more data that the player gets better, meaning that they're constantly like the colleges are identifying them as somebody who has gotten better and that they need to come get them. And then you got better and then they need to come get them. And then they continue to have success at those different places. You're learning a bunch of different things. First of all, that they're on an upwards trajectory and that other people have co-signed that evaluation of them. And then also that they have the ability to do well in different systems, schemes, languages, that they can hit the ground in a new system. They can adapt quickly, that they can learn and turn that around into production on the field. Like we have more data. There's more signal coming out of a lot of things that are draft related than we ever have before. I use Matt Leinart and only because this is a top of mind guy for me, where you have quarterbacks that used to come out of college and they were in one system the entire time and they did really well, right? But you can't separate the question of how much is him and how much is the system or the coaching or the caliber of players that they're throwing to or working with. And I think now that's going away to a degree because we're getting a lot more answers to know who those people are, where it's like about them, as opposed to some set of circumstance that we don't know how to distribute credit for. So I think that that's a really interesting way that just the draft is changing. And I am not even remotely shocked that the Rams are on the front end of that. And far be it for me, I'm not going to question anything that the Rams do in the draft because they've proven that they can crush this. I do think it's a little bit interesting that in terms of the positions that they took, you could look at, like running back, for instance, that they used a 4th round draft pick, their 3rd pick in the draft on a running back when they just drafted Blake Corum last year. And he got on the field relatively infrequently because Kyren Williams was there. They like to go with like one guy predominantly. Does this tell us something about Blake Corum and what they think about him? Or do you think that they're just loading up, hey, running backs get hurt and we just need to have a lot of depth there?
Yeah, I think they're just building depth because Kyren Williams did have to take a grand majority of those snaps. And if you're a fantasy fan, that was great for you. But if you're looking at some of the efficiency numbers, they weren't quite there. So I think you want to get Kyren back to an equilibrium where he's able to be efficient without him being on the field and people automatically loading up boxes. So I think it's more just like adding an arrow to the quiver than anything. Perhaps it does say something about Blake Corum. I know that he had like minor injury stuff last year as well. But I think Sean McVay just wants options, and we've seen them want options, in the past. In the heyday, it was like CJ Anderson and Todd Gurley were both getting heavy usage. So I think the more running backs, the better. And typically when we do see really, really effective backfields, historically, at least recently, it is those 1-2 punches or multiple punches that kind of make the difference.
They took a wide receiver with their last pick, 242 in round 7. It's the only wide receiver that they took in the draft. That was a position that I thought maybe they might be thinking that they could upgrade here because just looking at their roster, you've got, obviously the loss of Cooper Kupp, they replace him in terms of like name value with Devontae Adams. So you've got Puka and you've got Devontae Adams, and then you've got Tutu Atwell still on the field as a starter, unless something happens in training camp where he is supplanted. He's been around for a really, really long time, and they've never really prioritized him. Were you surprised that they didn't try to upgrade at that specific spot? Unless they think that they did with 242.
Well, I think the upgrade came with round 2, pick 14, Terrence Ferguson. I think they have gone around the tight end position, and it hasn't really been a position of strength for them in a long time. And I think with Devontae and Puka and the way that they like to play, I think they're viewing Terrence Ferguson as an addition to that pass catching unit. And I think that more was the upgrade to where Mumfeld was probably more of like, a swing or someone that they think could be a special teamer or something like that. I think the true upgrade there was adding to the tight end position.
Okay. Fair enough. That's a good point. All right. So that's number 3 on our countdown from 3 to 1 with a couple of asterisks at the top in the form of an honorable mention. Who's the team that you liked second best in the draft?
So this is kind of a cohesive, all-encompassing offseason evaluation, I would suppose. But the storyline coming into the draft was that the Washington Commanders probably didn't love a lot of the options in this draft. They traded a lot of draft capital for guys like Deebo Samuel, for guys like Marshawn Lattimore, for guys like Laramie Tunsil. And so the thought process was, we want certified players because we don't think players in this draft can help us, particularly at the premium positions, left tackle, cornerback, and wide receiver. They end up kind of, just because the mechanics of the draft, being able to double down on those positions in the draft with players that people liked. Josh Connerly didn't necessarily fall to them, but he was considered like one of the better surefire, in quotes, tackles in this draft. They end up picking him up in the first round. Thought that was a pretty good pick just based on of our analytics. We thought he was a good player. And then also premium position first round on a team that has a rookie quarterback. Yeah. Kudos to them in terms of process. Then later in the draft, they get Trey Amos at the cornerback position, which is a position of need. And he falls a little bit to them. Mm-hmm. And that just makes those two picks just make a lot of sense to me. And especially given the limited draft capital that they actually did have, I'm a big fan. And then just because I was at the Shrine Bowl, this is very biased, but the Kane Medrano pick made a lot of sense to me, given how they use Frankie Louvu. Medrano is more of like a true Sam backer, which we don't really see a lot of usage of.
Sam backer. I've never even thought about that in relation to your name and position.
Ironically, I didn't even, in our defense, I didn't play Sam backer, but I technically played Will in the Tulane defense.
Just real missed opportunity there, Tulane.
Yeah, true missed out. We played defensive ends instead of linebackers at the rush position. So we had some big guys, both of which are in the NFL currently. So that can tell you something. Two are in the NFL, and I'm sitting here talking about football. So. But I thought it was a good selection given the way they used Frankie Louvu, and then Jackson Kralski-Merritt, another guy that the analytics like, the running back. They love a stable of running backs. They used like 4 at times last year, a lot of gap scheme runs from them. And just overall, I think it was, given the limited draft capital that they had as a result of their decisions immediately preceding the draft, I thought they approached it well, and they took premium positions at positions of need at good value. And when those 3 things come together, I think it's a victory for your draft season.
I mean, they put themselves in a position to have a victory almost no matter what, because of the lack of just glaring needs, right? Like I can't recall, and maybe you can, another team that has flipped their roster so fast to go from having the 2nd overall pick and then all of a sudden the next year we're like, gosh, what do they need? Let's just let it come to us. Like that's a draft luxury position that usually isn't seen that quickly.
I think it's a true testament, number one, to Jaden Daniels, because your life gets a lot easier at the wide receiver position when you have a good quarterback.
Yep.
Like it could have gotten, and I mean, like realistically looking at Terry McLaurin, who was a borderline all-pro this year, but in previous years was looked at as like, yeah, he's a good wide receiver 1. And then you add Deebo Samuel, who had a lot of questions this year, but we feel, he has an all-pro pedigree. I could see how that could get dicey during the season, particularly if injuries start getting involved. But I think people just trust Jaden Daniels at this point. And the best way to continue trust in Jaden Daniels is to continue building up the offensive line in front of him.
Yep. All right, so that's number 2. I can't wait to hear your number 1. I wonder if it's my number 1.
So for my take, I thought number 1 was the Seattle Seahawks.
Yes.
So I'm gonna start off with a knock because there's so much positive. I'm a little worried about taking two quote non-positional value guys with their first and second round picks. They go Gray Zabel in the first round. He was listed and called out as a guard. I think he's a true swing offensive lineman for them going into camp.
Maybe center.
Maybe center. Maybe he'll play reps at tackle. I think they're going to probably view him at every single. They're going to evaluate where he can play and then put him into a right position. That being said, according to EDP, not necessarily a reach. People thought he was going to go about in that range. And offensive line was like the position of need for them.
100%. And let me point out really quickly here, he was the tier break. I feel like he was a tier break. And you could argue Simmons and like there were some other guys here, but it felt like they were in that next tier to a degree of guys who had some question marks attached to them for various reasons. It felt like, especially if we're talking about interior guys, that you're looking at maybe Kelvin Banks is a guard. Okay, we're sort of in that tier of like maybe secondary offensive tackle, but also might be a guard. And then you've got Tyler Booker, who I think a lot of people loved as like a culture setting, like I'm going to, maul your face off type of guard. And then you've got Gray Zabel, who is this just really strong. I could see him being a guy that you just put on the interior line. And he's like a guy who maybe quietly is on a number of, all pro or Pro Bowl type teams. Like, I feel like he's just the kind of guy who goes there and quietly does really good work for a prolonged period of time. And I think that was sort of, in my mind, that was where the tier break was. So I think that in with that in mind, it also makes the pick, even if you're like, it's guard and at that spot, like, is that sexy or exciting? I think it was a really smart pick for them.
I tend to agree. And we had Quinn on Friday. He's done a lot of hard, diligent work on the value of swing offensive linemen, how it's becoming a swing offensive lineman league, especially given the addition of another game, perhaps the addition of another game down the line, and how you just really need depth. And moreover, guys who can start at one position, and if another position gets hurt, move out to that position. I think that's the selection of Gray Zabel. That's why I'm okay with their first pick. Then Nickem and Worry with their second pick, the safety position, a little questionable.
Mm-hmm.
However, we have seen safeties go gangbusters in Mike McDonald's defense, namely ones that look like Nickem and Worry.
I was going to say the Seahawks have seen safeties go gangbusters. The Seahawks fans are quite familiar with
exactly
Seahawks, safeties of his caliber.
Yeah, team and coach fit. I think they're going to utilize him and Worry all over the field. On Friday, I was looking at his utilization and his grades by literal like alignment on the field. South Carolina put him in a bunch of places. They didn't like utilize him to the maximum there. I think he's going to be a guy who is kind of the opposite of Malachi Starks, where I think Malachi Starks is going to go to the Ravens, have his role limited, but be a every down player and really succeed at those things. I think it's the opposite for Emin Worry. I think Emin Worry is going to go to Mike McDonald's kind of plug and play defense and operate in a bunch of different positions, given his size and athleticism, and particularly his kind of, it would get lost if you just look at his size. You'd think he'd be like a Bam Bam Cam type player. He's really a coverage guy. And I think that ability, more than anything, is going to be helpful. And, second round safety, maybe not the best value at the position, but we are seeing the safety position kind of slowly bump up more around to the DBs.
But
and so I did like this selection.
He was getting mocked when you say maybe not the best value. Both of the safeties were consistently getting mocked in the first round. So if he falls to you in the second round, that feels like value. What do you mean when you say maybe not the best value?
I'm just talking about surplus value. So the safety position is, number one, very difficult to predict on a year-to-year level. And number two, very, very dependent on scheme. Now, Mike McDonald's scheme is the best one to be a safety in. So very nice there. But the point being is that, like, if you were to take the left tackle position, the difference if he ends up being a top 5 guy between what you're paying him and what you're paying Laramie Tunsil is like a massive difference, to where the difference between what you're paying, Nickem and Worry versus what you're paying, like, name a safety, Tyrann Mathieu, for example, is not going to be as large. But you are correct in terms of a guy who's falling just because of the mechanics of the draft. Emin Worry was great value in terms of EDP.
And I mean, just going back to your point to paint a further picture about the coach, that it, like in terms of him landing in the perfect spot, like this is the guy who made Kyle Hamilton a thing, right? I mean, Kyle Hamilton is obviously a thing, but just in terms of like lifting that up and how often we hear his name during Ravens games and then going, this is, the same type of defense that is going to pick up Nicky Manwari. I love it.
And I think if you wanted to draw parallels, it makes a lot of sense. Like Kyle Hamilton, similar body type, but was a coverage guy. We saw that in stark relief this year when the defense started to take a turn for the worse in Baltimore. And they're like, actually, we're just going to make Kyle Hamilton the deep safety. Like that's just what's going to happen to teams. And all of a sudden, they're one of the best defenses in the league. And so I think that's what we're in for with Nick Manwari with that second round pick.
How about the tight end, Elijah Arroyo, who is another guy who I think, you get him at pick 50, and I think you could make an argument. By the way, we could go pick by pick. It's almost like, Sam, the Seahawks were cheating off of our notes here at Sumer and or vice versa, because you're going to find that we are pretty much in alignment with a lot of the picks that they made here in terms of our scouts and our data. But Elijah Arroyo, our scouts had him just outside that top tier of tight ends. So there's Loveland and Warren, and then like a tier that includes Elijah Arroyo. They liked him. It went through the notes, and I'm not going to be too detailed here. But like every descriptive thing that you could think of, it was very good X, very good X. The term very good came up so much in the write-up about him. And then in terms of our advanced data, Sumer score 88th percentile. And one of the things that I noticed, his college career, the entire thing, and this year trends upwards in terms of scores. Like if you zoom out, all of our tracking data is just an upwards trajectory, going back to the signal about the transfer up guys with the Rams defensive line conversation. I think that same signal exists here with Elijah Arroyo in terms of just getting better and better and better.
Exactly. And I think we were questioning what the weapons were going to look like for this team when all of a sudden they don't have DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. And they answered that with a lot of these picks. Or at least they're going to try to answer it with volume in the draft, which that's a whole nother discussion to have why I like this draft. Just the sheer amount of picks that they had indicated a strategy that they want to build through the draft. As a result, one of those, as a result, one of those was Elijah Arroyo, who, the analytics like this was a strong tight end draft. They get him at a pretty good pick for a tight end. And, you just start cranking right along. You just start rattling off the birdies and the pars on the golf course.
Yep.
And it starts looking good, at least in terms of the process that you're applying to this draft.
Jalen Milroe, 92. I mean, Jalen Milroe is a guy who I was saying the week of the draft, like my, hot take, and I'm not a hot take person, so I didn't necessarily believe this, but it was like I just want to put my name attached to this just in case it happens, because I think it might happen. It clearly didn't happen. I thought that he might be a guy that could go like in the bottom of the first round and be the surprise guy, because the upside is so strong from a rushing standpoint. And then if you go back 2 years, like our Sumer data for him, overall passing everything at Alabama 2 years ago, he was like upper 90th percentile. And then last year it kind of fell off a cliff. There's a different offense. But I sort of wonder, like, if we lifted him out and put him in the draft process after 2023 as opposed to 2024, what are the different conversations that we're having about what the holes are in his passing game? Are we as on the fence about him as an NFL quarterback? I'm not 100% sure. So I really like, especially the fact that you're able to get him that deep in the draft. And I have gone on record all over the place saying I don't actually like third round running. I mean, my God, Lindsay, quarterbacks, because of the lack of opportunity that actually exists within the NFL schedule to develop quarterbacks. I think we talk about bringing guys on and developing them, and then so frequently there's just no actual opportunity because the starter gets all the reps and all of the attention. But in this case, he goes to a place where Sam Darnold, in a perfect case, like he hits consistently, and then we don't have to Jalen Milroe, then it's like a win-win, right? But if it doesn't hit and it feels much more like an on the fence average to above average starter in terms of Sam Darnold and the history that we have of him. So I like the fact that you have somebody that you are developing for the future. And I think that this is exactly the scenario where you can do that purposefully, almost like Green Bay did with Jordan Love, right? Like where you have a starter here, you don't need him right away. And you can work with him off to the side, knowing in a perfect world, we actually want to pivot to you in a few years. And I think that this is the kind of situation with Sam Darnold where that actually makes sense as a strategy.
If you wanted to build out a scenario for the Seahawks adding a quarterback, I think this is the best case scenario. They get a guy who had the highest highs in college of any player in this draft. I mean, I'm almost like the guy who keeps getting broken up with by a girl and the girl keeps coming back. And then you're like, oh, I still love you. Like, yeah. And then you just get broken up with again. Cause I thought he was my favorite for the Heisman at the beginning of the year. He was then my favorite for the Heisman after the Georgia game, which was the highest high of any quarterback in this draft, period. Like Cam Ward had a bunch of awesome games. There was nothing like Jalen Milroe's performance against Georgia, where it was like, okay, this guy is the best player I've ever seen in my whole life. Like running, passing, it was ridiculous. Like crunch time, all of it. And at that time, it seemed like the quarterback whisperer, Kalen DeBoer, was doing it again, where he sent Jake Haener from Fresno State into the NFL. He resuscitates Michael Penix post-injury into a first-round quarterback, or at least like a second-round quarterback, a top quarterback in a very, very heavy quarterback draft. And then it felt like, oh, here we go again, Jalen Milroe. And then the offense just didn't come together in the way that it needed to. And I think there was a lot of youth on that Alabama offense, and it was changing tides, not to, be too punny, but changing tides for the Tide. And it just didn't end up working out. And then he goes into LSU and does it all again and ropes me right back in. I'm like, he still had a chance to win the Heisman late into last year, like was still top 5 odds. Despite, some weird Alabama losses. And so when you put all that together with the inconsistencies, quietly him slipping into the 4th was a little bit of a shock as well. He was invited to the draft by the NFL. Like the NFL thought that he was going to go in the first round. So all of those packages coming together, I do worry a little bit about him going into a heavy under center zone run scheme, which is what Clint Kubiak likes to run. But I also witnessed the innovation that Clint Kubiak did with the Saints of how he would use Taysom Hill and how he would utilize motion and basically try everything in his power to make the quarterback's job easy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an excellent fit for Jalen Milroe, as far as I'm concerned.
If we're taking dart throws, this is the guy in this range that I'm all of my darts are here. Because while it might not hit, and there might be enough reasons that you're like, I don't want to use a first on this because then I'm sort of behind the 8 ball if it doesn't hit. Now you're in round 3, pick 92, 100%. I'm not going in a different direction ahead of this. Once you get into the tier of quarterbacks that you're sure are developmental quarterbacks, this is the one I want to develop because this is the one where if it hits, you have potentially an all-pro, like, the ways that his specific strengths that we know exist that can hit the ground on day 1, the areas in which we know he is strong are elite.
Right.
And I'm not sure I can say that about any other aspect of any of these other quarterbacks' games. Like they might be good enough. You might have an above average quarterback and they might be more fully fleshed out. They might be more pro ready, all of those things. But like, are they getting you to that like Lamar Jackson? What's the upside? What's the ceiling look like? Here, if we can flush out the questions that we have in the passing game, and there are questions, I'm not saying this is a for sure thing, but I'm saying if you can check those boxes, now you have a guy who can absolutely put you over the top. Because he's a weapon in a bunch of different ways. And so I love this pick at 92.
I mean, this was a guy who people were saying was the best running quarterback prospect since Lamar Jackson. Yeah. And no one really blinked an eye on that one. No. That's just a testament to like what he can. I mean, people in Baton Rouge like have nightmares about this guy. He did it twice to them. So yeah, I just love the pick.
Yeah. Another guy, and I'm sort of cannibalizing your list now because I co-signed the Seahawks so hard. Another guy that I love in this draft class is Torrey Horton, 5th round pick, 166 from Colorado State. This is a wide receiver. So our scouts liked him. I'm going to play with like how to establish how much they liked him. There are tiers, and the tiers have different grades, right? Like that I'm on the same tier as Ted. Like we're not talking about a like, okay, they're the top wide receivers, and then there's Torrey Horton down here. Like Torrey Horton is up there, like in a group of wide receivers, according to our scouts here at Sumer, that he wasn't really discussed as being in the same company as. Our tracking data very much liked him as well. Obviously, he was hurt last year, but in 2023, he ranked in the 97th percentile in terms of his Sumer score. So again, if you're talking about, a range of the draft where it's value, like it's risk assessment, like what kind of payoff will I get if this hits, if the ceiling is there, then I think that he's a guy who potentially has a very high ceiling.
Torrey Horton, I think, dropped because of injury, and I think that's really the only reason. I'd put him in a class or not a tier, like almost an archetype, kind of similar to Luther Burden, where everyone thought this guy has a high ceiling. It's just, what is the reason why he may not reach it? And in his case, it was injury. Also, there's like a slight thing, which is interesting because, I played against Romeo Doubs, for example, who played for the same coach, same scheme, but at Colorado State, they were running like the widest of wide out air raid offenses. And he was able to create consistently in that Colorado State offense for multiple years. And so if we're talking about guys who you just are trying to collect good pieces and guys who can contribute and guys who can maybe make it past year 2 and maybe start past year 2, which is like the difference between the slight elements of the tiers. It's like, okay, Tet might be an impact starter in year 1. Torrey Horton might be an impact starter in year 2, but both of them could be impact starters long-term. And I really loved him coming in this draft. A little bit biased because I did watch a lot of those games because I did play against Jay Norvell, and I do understand how the Jay Norvell offense works as a result. But Romeo Doubs is a quality starter on an NFL team. I think that kind of legacy continues with Torrey Horton as far as I'm concerned.
So these are a lot of picks that we feel pretty strongly that we like.
Yeah, and there's more picks like it. Like Riley Mills, for example, is another one. We thought he was an excellent pass rusher. We were concerned about his run defense, but you look at the type of defensive tackles that he succeeded with, that Mike McDonald succeeded with, and they're all these big, guys. Like last year, Leonard Williams, 6'5", 300. Like that's the type of defensive tackle, that 3-tech that Riley Mills is. So excellent depth piece there. And then the coup de grace for me, anyone who's listened to Sumer Daily or Draft FM knows, I'm like the biggest Ricky White stan of all time, and I watched UNLV and Syracuse and the UNLV Syracuse game probably more than any human being that is in the community at all. I was obsessed. And Ricky White was an All-American 2 years ago. Then this year is the best player on the field for most of the games. And then last year he was a returner. This year he's like, you know what? I'm just going to be a normal spec ops guy. And he blocks 3 kicks and is the Mountain West Special Teams Player of the Year. So 7th round pick. I mean, if you just want a guy who can be a special teams guy, like they hit, if I were a scout and I'm not a scout, I would be like banging the fist, like this guy can be a special teams guy. And 7th round, everyone claps their hands and says, yeah, we got a guy who can contribute to special teams. And that's not even considering the fact that he was an All-American wide receiver 2 years ago. So it's a beautiful thing when things come together.
Very, very vaguely, I'm just going to say that our scouts had him ranked higher than a lot of other guys who went earlier in the draft.
Yeah, and I think it's AI meeting the eye. When the AI meets the eye, it works out. And what the eye said is that he was immensely productive no matter who lined up in front of him. And the only time he wasn't productive was when they had Matthew Sluka at quarterback, who didn't throw the ball. So he wasn't productive because they weren't throwing the ball. So tough to say.
I see the question in the chat from Asa Arnold, who wants to know about Danny Stutzman. We will get to that because we have thoughts about Danny Stutzman for sure. But first I want to wrap up like the team thoughts here. So we've got our 3 through 1. We've added a couple of honorable mentions, a few teams that we haven't talked about that I think are worth talking about. You did not mention the Patriots, for instance, who I think actually did a very, very good job, had a ton of picks. And I think you could also argue, we talked about value. I think they got a lot of value. Did you not? Why do the Patriots not make this list for you? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think it's very tight. I think that in essence, what they did was approach their offense and defense. I think they just kind of needed everything to a certain degree. So it's tough to gauge like which one of these players will contribute, which won't. But there are, as you noted, a ton of names on here that are great. I do think it's easier to have a better draft.
Are we dinging them because they drafted a kicker?
I mean, hey, we have research on SumerSports.com right now from Eric Eager last year that was like, don't draft a kicker, draft a punter. So, they also drafted a long snapper. So, they just tried to address literally every position on the field, saying, I think they wait. Let's roll through it. I think they addressed every position on the field. So much. Tackle. Center, so let's say interior offensive line. They all added another tackle, Marcus Bryant on Missouri, so let's say all 3 line positions, because I'm sure one of those guys will end up being a guard. Okay. Running back, wide receiver, so every offensive position except for quarterback. Defensive tackle, edge, DB, safety. So the only thing they didn't get was a linebacker, like on the whole field.
Long snapper, kicker,
and punter. Excuse me.
Have we ever seen a team draft 2 special teams players?
I'm trying to, like, I remember one of the Fergusons went in the draft at long snapper. So maybe that Miami Dolphins. I'm sure there's been a kicker and a punter, but the kicker punter
not
long
in the draft. I'm saying on one team. One team goes, hey, we got 2. We got 2 that are going to go practice right over there.
It's a great question.
Like what? Oh man. Okay. Fair enough. I want to get your thoughts on the Browns, because I think that you come at the Browns draft from a very data centric, like you're looking at numbers and value of the numbers, and I'm looking at players, and I think they're 2 totally different conversations. So tell me what you liked about the Browns draft.
Not only are there 2 totally different conversations with regards to the draft generally, but those 2 conversations are split with the Browns draft in particular. So
I think it's split in the Browns front office.
Hey, I mean, you said it, not I. But you look at what they did in terms of the players that they selected, and we have a blue chip item for every single player except for Quinshon Judkins, who was one of the most productive players whilst he was at Ole Miss. Last year, he split a backfield, was part of an awesome backfield with Travion Henderson, and I think that's probably going to be the plan for him moving forward. So just like running through real quick, Mason Graham. I thought you could have considered him a blue chip player in this draft if you really wanted to. Pass rush, run stuff all the way back from the time he was a freshman. He was excellent. Carson Schlesinger, immensely athletic. The only down thing that nixed his athletic score was bench press, vertical jump, horizontal jump, incredible. So athleticism with Carson Schlesinger. Harold Fannin, receiving and yards after the catch. Bowling Green, ? But blue chip there in terms of his profile. Gabriel, we're talking about passing production. Did it at 3 different levels. There you go with that. Dylan Sampson, rushing, elusiveness, rush yards over expected, all blue chip in terms of our Sumer scores. And then Shedeur Sanders, we talked about it over and over again, blue chip accuracy. That was his calling card. So that's the player side. But then you look at the value side. We're selecting a linebacker with the first pick in the 2nd round. We're selecting a running back immediately after that. We're selecting a tight end from a very, very small school. We're selecting a, for lack of a better term, diminutively sized quarterback who most people did not have in the top 100. And most people had at least quarterback 6. The people who did really deep work, such as mock draft database, which is kind of skewed because people just grade more quarterbacks because people care about the quarterbacks, had him at like quarterback 9. You select him above Shedeur Sanders, who was substantially above him in the consensus big board, but you still get Shedeur Sanders. So then you take multiple shots at a quarterback, and it's just like a jumble of uniqueness. Do I like the multiple shots on quarterback? Yes. Do I like the reach on Gabriel? Probably not. Would I have liked it if it was opposite? Yes. So who really cares? Like, and then it becomes this kind of big question mark. So that's my very stream of consciousness thoughts on their defense. To summarize, did they get players who have blue chip profiles? Yes. Does that matter given how variant the draft is? Maybe not as much as you would like it to matter. Did they select those players at positional value? Not really. And did they make some pretty big reaches? Yes. What does that end up looking like this year? I have no idea.
I think one of the things that makes it hard, it's just hard to get over the feelings that we have watching the way that this draft was handled, and to just put it into an unbiased prism, because them moving off of Travis Hunter feels perplexing to me. So, and to specifically move to, even though they picked up more value, right? So you have to look at that in a different way, which I'll talk about in a second. But when you move off of Travis Hunter, who felt like the slam dunk in this draft, and you have an opportunity to draft him, and he could potentially, in a best case scenario, impact both sides of the ball, it feels confusing to me to then move off of the opportunity to take that guy and then move to a spot 5 where clearly they thought that Mason Graham, their evaluation was that he will operate on the inside of that defensive interior next to Myles Garrett. I mean, holy heck, that's beautiful, right? But also they think that he will do that elitely. I think that 5 was where we kind of got confusing in this draft. I felt like the top 4 was pretty clear, and then we got to 5, and it felt like 5 was pretty clear for a long time, and then the week before the draft it got super muddy, and that might have been because there was a lot of smoke, because they were trying to set the groundwork for this to happen. But there was a lot of I don't know if Mason Graham is that guy. Maybe it's deeper at defensive tackle. Maybe there's not that much difference between Mason Graham and a Derek Harmon or Kenneth Grant, depending on which flavor do you like the best. And so to move into that position where it felt like it was where the flatness started of the draft, off of a can't miss prospect by most accounts, that just felt confusing. And how do you, at some point you have to hit on the guys, right? So it's not just a bunch of numbers and draft picks. Now you have an opportunity to bring a guy in who is a game changer, and you're like, nah, we're just going to keep making this confusing for us. It felt very Browns-like in a way that confused me. Just take the sure thing. Now that said, getting a 1 so that next year maybe the quarterback draft is better. You could take more shots at this. If somebody emerges as an absolutely can't miss prospect, the Browns will be positioned to go get that guy.
Right.
As will the Rams be, although I imagine that their capital will be a little bit further down the board. It might be harder. But then they draft 2 quarterbacks. And I don't know. And I know that this is the conversation that a lot of people are having is did they intend to draft 2 quarterbacks? And that shot of them in the front office, I'm not trying to what I think it looked like. It may not have actually been, but it didn't look like a front office that was super stoked because man, we pulled the wool over everybody's eyes and we got both of them. Yes, we're celebrating. It looked like maybe something had happened. What I want to feel like always with a team is that they had a plan and that they executed the plan. And I have concerns that maybe the plan was overtaken there, or we went off course. We were like, oh, something else is happening and this was not our plan. And we all do this in our fantasy drafts where you're like, crap, I feel like I'm chasing now, or something's happening and maybe I need to take this guy. And then you just don't feel good about it afterward. You're like, I got out of sorts. That's what it looked like to me. So my feeling is do they have a plan here, or did they just grab him, Shedeur Sanders, because he was there and it felt weird that he was still there and they wanted the there to stop? And now you've got all these quarterbacks, Sam, and you got to come up with a plan. Joe Flacco, Kenny Pickett, Shedeur Sanders, Dylan Gabriel. I'm just going to take Deshaun Watson out of the mix because I don't think he's a factor there moving forward. But you have so many guys. Who doesn't make the roster? Are they going to carry 4? The third isn't even going to be part of, like, you're going to be the practice squad guy. Like, you have a lot of guys. And so what's the plan for how to handle that?
I think it's an excellent point. And I think outside of kind of the mid-round picks, I think there's so much value here. We have to go off the plan that we've been putting together for 6 months. Kind of happened to them twice. And maybe that's the best explanation of what happened to the Browns in this draft. It's like, we're ready to draft Travis Hunter. We're putting out things in the media that he's like Shohei Ohtani and we intend to play him on both sides and blah, 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 blah. And then literally something that if I had to explain passing it up to the ownership would be hard to sell. And I have a very detailed analytics crew that is telling me that no one has ever played both sides in the history of the NFL, or at least modern history of the NFL. And this player has so many snaps on him at a slightly less premium position than defensive tackle, but still slightly less value than defensive tackle, and also less predictability than the defensive tackle position as well. And I can get a first round pick next year as well. I'm basically flooring the other team in the trade. And you're like, oh man, it's almost like when you go to the grocery store and you just want a bag of chips and you go up to the counter and they're like, well, it's 2 for $1 for the bag of chips. And you're like, yeah, but I don't really want 2 bags of chips, but maybe I'll eat them later or something. And then you just end up eating both of the bags of chips. That's what it felt like their entire draft was like, oh, we're excited to draft Travis Hunter. Oh, wait, they're offering us such a good package on draft day that we can't pass it up. So we have to pass it up. We have them in the same tier. All the planning is saying this is great, but man, like, it would have been cool to have Travis Hunter. And then down the line, it's like, wait, the rest of the league let Shedeur Sanders fall how far? Like, there's just so much value at this point.
Not the rest of the league. The Browns did. They picked 6 times with the spotlight directly on them going, is it Shedeur? Literally every time they picked, America wondered if it was going to be Shedeur. And 6 times they said nope. And one of those times they said different quarterback, psych. And then they were like, yeah, now is the time. What?
Yeah, that's an even better. I literally didn't say it better than you, Lindsay. Like, that is a much better summarization. And then it's like you're at the cash register and they're like, but you can have this other player that everyone thought was better than the one you picked. And moreover, you can have him at such a late value that it's really not going to hurt you at all. And they're like, okay. It's just crazy how this draft
2
turned
for
out.
$1 at the store. And you're like, I don't need 2. But I mean, if you give it to me for free, I'll take 2.
Yeah, that happened twice to them in this draft. And so I think between those 2 items, which on their face, especially given the analytical case that I've laid out of odds are Travis Hunter is not going to play a lot of snaps, and odds are that the pressure rate and the run stuff rate that Mason Graham is slightly more likely to carry over than the coverage stuff in the past, probably just the coverage stuff, frankly, for Hunter to go to the next level. And you're like, if we have them both as, blue chip or green players, then they're technically in the same tier. Plus, we're getting a first rounder next year. So it's just funny. Like, analytically, those 2 moves may have been enough to, quote, win the draft for them. And then in the middle, you get a lot of kind of analytically confusing selections for the most part. And it's an incongruent draft. There's a lot of asymmetry to this draft of, I don't really understand it, but I'm glad it turned out seemingly well for them.
TJ Sanders did well in our analytics, right? Like 98th percentile pass rush, SumerScore. We had a fairly high scouting grade on him. Anyway, okay, so Browns. Let's see. Where are we going to go from here? Oh, wait, did I just throw in somebody who's not on the Browns? Never mind.
The Bills did have a good draft, though. I will note.
I wrote Browns next to his name, and I just was desperately scanning my notes for something good to say. after saying all of the other things that I said, and your face told me that I was off there. So never mind.
I mean, the biggest thing about the Browns draft is that, like, on paper, it turned out great for them.
By the way, though, let's just not pass by the fact that I was trying desperately to find a compliment, and I complimented the Bills. Okay.
Well, I mean,
Congrats,
it really is
Bills.
interesting. And
like that pick.
This comes back to the draft just more generally as well, as like the politics of the draft are so interesting because it is literally the most valuable lottery in sports. Like, if you do well in a draft, like the Saints did, you were going to be all those years ago, you were going to be good for half a decade. If you do poorly in the draft, you're going to get immediately fired, and you're going to get all your buddies fired too. And so, and no one knows how to do it correctly. And so you try to implement these processes. It seems as if the Eagles have perfected the draft somehow. And then at the end of the day, it's like, we won, but politically we lost. And I think the Browns are the first team in the history. And again, I don't know what the politics are behind it. I just know what's in the media. But I think the Browns, notoriously not the best drafting team on earth, just created a new way to have a questionable draft, which I didn't think could ever be done.
Let's talk about those are the teams that we liked the best and a team that we needed to discuss. Let's go over some players that we think are, like that their fan base might like hearing our thoughts about, because we liked them from a values standpoint. I'm going to start at the top here. Because I think that some people think, and some of the data, if you're just looking at like where on the consensus big board and where he ended up going, some people might analytically call it a reach.
Yep.
And that's Colston Loveland. And the conversation that was had, and I heard Seth Rollins, who, you and I are both into the WWE, and I'm a big Seth Rollins fan. So I watched all of his appearances on everything, and he's a big Bears fan. And he was like, no one was talking about Colston Loveland. And I wanted to send him a DM of my mock draft where I had the Bears taking Colston Loveland, but that's a sidebar. I think that in general, people were like, what? Like, we were excited about tight end. And there was even that one video of the fans, like there was a draft party and one guy stands up because they're like tight end and he's like, we got him. And then they're like Colston Loveland and he sits down and everyone's like, what? That wasn't what we thought was coming out of your mouth next. I think so our scouts had the same grade on Loveland as they did on Warren. And it looks like he was maybe a little bit better. This matches some of the evaluation that we heard in the media. I think Nate Tice did a really, really interesting deep dive on these two. Looks like maybe he was a little bit better in the passing game, intangible stuff like toughness and instincts off the charts. In terms of our Sumer scores, Tyler Warren was 99th percentile. Loveland was 97th. So both, the guy that we latched onto early to use an example of this class being so good was Tyler, when in reality, there wasn't that much difference between the two. Yeah. And so it felt like an upset when Loveland went earlier, when in reality, the two were much closer than the broader draft market discussed. I think that we do that sometimes. We allow narratives to kind of run away with themselves. What I learned at the combine was that the Cam or Shador narrative that we were having at the time had run away with itself, that they were not as close as people were saying. We heard multiple people tell us then, I think that Shador might be closer to that next tier of quarterbacks than he is to Cam Ward, right? Like that was our first clue that maybe we were having conversations that were off. I think this is the opposite of that the conversations latched onto one guy where really we should have been having conversations were about those two guys. Does that make sense?
Right. And again, talking to friends in NFL circles as well, I think they were a lot tighter than expected. And as you noted, they were very tight in most everything, in both analytically and with our scouting team as well, who had years and years, I think the 600 plus years collectively of scouting experience. And so
we've got a lot of people that have done this for a very long time on staff. Yeah.
And so when I think there's two elements which come into it, which is like, number one, when you're trying to, define the needle, I think a lot of people just looked at the sheer production of Tyler Warren in the context of a really good team. And we're like, oh yeah, that's great for 24. Regrettably not remembering that Loveland did so the year before with a really good team. And this year they basically had no quarterback. And so obviously it's a little dependent on that, but I think you nailed it, Lindsay. It's those two guys were very close to each other in the eyes of the league, in the eyes of the analytics. The tight end positional value in the first round does make it so that you probably would rather, swing for the guy who has the better resume and then maybe wait until a second round. And then moreover, I think this particular draft class where we talked about guys like Terrence Ferguson, Elijah Arroyo, even all the way down to the Chargers pickup, Oronde Gadsden. And the idea of, as Sean says here, like the long aging curve of some of these guys does make it so that there's uncertainty. But if you have two guys that you believe are good pass catchers that can pass catch year one, and then as Thomas says, grow into that blocker later on, it kind of becomes pick of the litter. And I think people were more willing to bet on Colson Loveland's athleticism, athletic traits, plus the production that they viewed as pretty similar to Warren's over Warren, who people loved the production, but didn't necessarily know if he had the traits to succeed at the next level.
Yeah.
Or maximally succeed at the next level, that is.
My overarching point is I don't want the Bears fans to think that they overthought it. Like, I think that they got a really good tight end, and if you were okay with Tyler Warren, you should be okay with Colson Loveland. That's my overarching thought. If you think maybe we should have gone with a different position here, but if you were fine with tight end and you like what tight end adds to your arsenal, and I think there's lots of reasons to be excited about that, then I think go ahead, get on board with Colson Loveland. And I was a little bit bummed that I think that this is where the draft media kind of set the table for somebody who's as good as Colson Loveland going somewhere and having a fan base be confused about it is not like, that's kind of a bummer. That felt like a bummer to me. And so I just wanted to clear that up from my end anyway. Like, I don't think there's any reason to think that you guys picked the wrong guy. I think they're both going to be very, very good. Who else? Who else is another guy that you want to co-sign?
I mean, I think there's a lot of quote reaches that you can kind of describe why the team there is a describable reason why the team may have wanted to reach.
Okay.
And we're Captain Positivity over here today because we love the draft. So like, if you want to make the argument, and this is just in terms of the trade, this is a tough argument to make, but on draft day, the trade was late breaking because there was a quarterback trade right before, and then there was mechanics going around, and all of a sudden they were picking James Pierce, the Falcons were, and then we didn't really know the trade until after round one ended. I was of the mind that if that was a pick swap, man, they got James Pierce and Jalen Walker. And moreover, you look at the Falcons draft as a kind of like coherent strategy. And a lot of the guys that they picked up were either on market in terms of availability or like slight droppers due to mechanical aspects, such as Jalen Walker. And so while as an analyst, I wouldn't have recommended making that trade for James Pierce, that particular trade, I do understand why they would want to go get him. And the reasons why are such. Number one, he was a post-combine faller. And we found in the data that there's a slight correlation that they actually perform up to their earlier combine or earlier like right before the combine when everyone has their valuation but hasn't talked to everyone else, that generally players will perform more to that rating than their like draft day rating. And I think there's a bunch of, points in which that may have actually occurred. Mason Graham is probably going to be one of them. Some of the quarterbacks, I guess, could be some of them as well. And I think that's going to be the case, or at least that's the argument for James Pierce. And then finally, dude was just a great pass rusher, according to our analytics and according to the scouts. I meeting the AI, plus the weird little consensus big board drop, plus the Falcons needing edge rushers and adding two of them. Kind of Jalen Walker may be more of a flex player. The pick was fine. I have confidence in the pick. I don't know if I have confidence in the trade, but I just want to make the argument for that. Sans the value out, because I do think we were actually all excited about what they did until we heard the value of the trade.
Yeah, that's it. That's a good point. And I do think that the trade is the part that is, so James Pierce has question marks attached to him.
Yeah.
For off-field reasons. that make it feel somewhat risky because you don't totally know what you're getting in that area. And that's why he fell to that point in the first place. And then to trade up, like, it's one thing, I think, if somebody like that who does check a lot of the on-field production boxes. So you're like, I mean, I kind of like in a relatively flat draft at the position at that point, if he falls to us, then I can totally see going, okay, let's do this. It's the trade up. So you're giving up capital that includes a first for next year in order to go take that risk.
Exactly.
That feels like, and I had somebody in the league describe it to me that way, where they were like, if it fell to you, that's a different conversation. But to trade up for the concerns that were attached to James Pierce is a move that there are several organizations in this league they would never, ever, like, I'm sure there were teams in the league that had him off their board for those reasons because they just won't build out their roster that way. They would never, I had one person tell me they would never trade up for him.
Interesting.
To take on that risk. So I just think that's the component that is like, oh, it puts it so much more under the microscope. Like he has to hit. He better because you gave up so much for it. And I just think you evaluate the move differently because they went and got him. What about okay, continue with the reaches. I think these are good boxes to check here.
Yeah, so we briefly touched about it at the top, but here's the argument of why I am generally okay with taking consensus big board 52 Jackson Dart at his EDP of 25. It only ends up being about a 16% reach in terms of EDP, and you are trading up for a quarterback. We discussed it at length. The positional value for a quarterback, particularly in the first round, is just a completely different game that you are playing than you are playing with position players, because you're paying $60 million for the top quarterback and you're paying like $40 million. It obviously the bridge is closing a little bit, but that's like multiple, like a big chunk of the percentage of the cap. That is a difference. So you're just playing a different game altogether. And then if you're making the argument for Dart over anyone else, he does have the accuracy, particularly in the short and intermediate regions. This is a place where the eye meets the AI. The scouts in their write-ups said, don't know about his long accuracy, not ideal. That showed up in the Sumer scores as well, but he did excel in short and intermediate accuracy. And he was just a productive guy over many years. And you want productive quarterbacks. Like, you don't want to pick guys that didn't do good things. Production over expected, passing Sumer scores. Obviously, there's some cons too as well. Struggled with long accuracy, as I said. There is an argument that he's a little bit of an overrated runner, particularly as it projects out to the NFL with a high scramble rate and a high sack rate. So I think if you're going to believe that there was a jumble of second tier quarterbacks, Shedeur Sanders, Tyler Shuck, Jalen Milroe, Dart, and that they were actually all a lot closer than expected, but you didn't think you were going to be able to get them at a certain pick with Shuck off the board, early on in the second round, and Dart off the board at that standpoint of his EDP of 25, I'm okay with that move. And so I think that is an explainable, good process trade up if that's what you want to do, particularly given that they also are taking multiple shots at the quarterback position.
Yep. I think everything that you just said made sense there. Also, that trade looked like even better because somebody made the trade right after them.
Right.
That looked like they gave up more to move up to a spot after that, which makes it feel like you just got like max value there. And as you articulated, it makes a lot of sense to make that trade for a quarterback, right? Like it's a totally different conversation. So it feels like you really got value in terms of the comp also. All right. Anyone else who you want to explain?
Final one I just got excited about because I like G5 guys. And this one was a massive reach. Upton Stout from the 49ers, 96.6% reach. So like a guy who,
Wait,
was he was like a borderline day 30 guy. Not a lot of people thought the cornerback out of Western Kentucky was going to get drafted. Like, this is a big value reach, but the 49ers do reach all the time. They did so twice last year for Ricky Pearsall and Isaac Guerendo. But if
Trey
you
Lance.
went and just looked at how he performed in the Sun Belt, the real reason why he's getting knocked is because he's like 5'7", 5'8". This dude is like a shadow at the Sun Belt level, like blue chip grades all around. So this was just a fun one because, you know, I like guys at the G5 level, that guys like Kyle Shanahan and Robert Saleh, who are excellent coaches, are like, I want to go get that guy. So kudos to them. You know,
I love that every once in a while for a team to just lock in on a guy. And by the way, and this is said every year, but I think it always stands to be said, just because you think it was a reach and that he could have been grabbed in the name that round later, that you think like this happens every year where fans go like, oh, we could have got him in the 6th round. Why do we use that on him? Like, if your team valued him enough to take him there, then they have to at least be betting that someone else out there evaluated him the same way. And if they love him, go get him. I don't have a problem at all. Your evaluation just better be right. But like, I don't care at all if you take him in the 3rd round when you could have had him in the 6th or whatever, because we don't know that you could have had him in the 6th. So
well, and this particularly comes into mind when we start getting, I believe this was a day 2 pick. When you start getting into day 3, your buckets or your tranches or your tiers of players get like massive. And so unless you have a ton of picks, you probably want to consider trading a lot of those picks for later value, because the tranches are so big and you could probably get undrafted free agents anyway. And so as a result, it's not as bad to reach on a guy in late day 2, day 3, as it is to do so in the first 15 picks, you know?
Am I wrong to think that there might be other people listening that are like, what's a tranche?
Yes. Yeah, it's a good point. So like when you're grading these players, when scouts are grading these players, or at the highest level the organization is, you're going to put projections on them. Typically the way they do it is like, we think this guy can be a starter now, and we think this guy is a backup. Well, there's a lot more backups in this league than there are all pros. And so as a result, you're only going to want to project like maybe 2 or 3 guys a year as an all pro, and maybe 6 or 7 guys as a pro bowler, and maybe 20 to 25 as a certified starter year 1. The difference is once you start getting into day 3, there's a lot of, I think this guy can be a quality special teams player. And so you'd rather take the shot on the guy that you think can be a really, maybe can play some snaps for you on defense year 1, rather than just like a special teams guy. So that's why I'm not as worried about that, because there's just a lot more flatness of the curve, I guess you could say, once you start going into round 6 and 7.
We had a request to talk about Danny Stutzman, and I think that we should give the people what they want. That was Asa Arnold, who asked earlier. He said he was his basketball teammate in middle school.
I love it.
So we should maybe be asking Asa about Danny Stutzman. But in the event that he is unable to give us his scouting report in the chat, let's tell him what we think. Which, by the way, is we like him.
Yeah, we talked
brass tacks.
We talked about him on Saturday on SiriusXM. He destroyed my Tulane Green Wave early on this season. But all around, like, you just look at the way the scouts view him, and you look at the way that the AI grades him, I think he has some questions in coverage, but he wasn't used a ton as like a primary coverage defender. He's a hammerhead in the run game. He destroys outside zone over and over and over and over and over again. What I'm most interested in is the Saints have had a very distinct Dennis Allen-based defense for years. And at times they were only playing one linebacker, and that was Demario Davis. And then other times they'd bring in Pete Werner. And in the Malcolm Jenkins years, it was a lot of DBs on the field, and it was basically just one guy. I don't think that is going to be the case with Brandon Staley. I think they're going to play a lot more two linebacker. There's going to be a hammerhead, a guy who is devoted to playing the run, and a coverage guy. And typically Demario Davis has been that guy who has been kind of everything. He's been a very good coverage guy. He's been a very good blitzer, and he's been a very good run defender. I think as he ages out, they're going to try to move more into that less complex role at the linebacker position, and Danny Stutzman could very well end up being the run stuffer that they need to complement maybe a guy like Pete Werner, who is a little bit more of a coverage guy.
As far as linebackers go, he is grouped with the top tier of linebackers by our scouts in this year's draft.
And so the question arises, like, why did he fall? I think the linebacker position is just really, really hard to predict. And so as a result, you get those guys. I mean, like last year, Edge Cooper was the best guy in the draft. He fell pretty solidly into the second round. And he ended up being an absolute game wrecker for the Packers.
100th percentile run defense.
He's a big dog.
He's numero uno at that position. I think Saints fans should be excited about that pick. So I'm kind of bummed. I have a feeling that what happened here is that, our buddy Asa, who knew Danny in middle school, had to go do other things. And so
maybe ask class.
Get his own scouting department. What he might be. No, you're right. He's definitely in class. He was his teammate in middle school. I was like, why are you making him a specific age? He literally told us how old he was, Lindsay. Stop being defensive. Okay, so I think that's is there anything else that you feel like you need to get off your chest here before we move on from this type of a conversation about the draft? And then next week we're like into the off season.
Yeah, I mean, it was looking back and reflecting, Lindsay, we've been in multiple cities discussing these players. Narratives have changed, information has come about, and I've said it in writing, I'll say it on air. You were right about Shedeur Sanders, but now we get to see what shows up on the field. And so I'm holding out hope that we see a little play time from Shedeur. But I have no take
with regard to that. It was a how is he seen?
Yeah. So now we just move on to whether or not the Cowboys are going to hit the over, and that's the next Sam Lindsay challenge for folks to follow.
I love it. Maybe the next step of this, maybe next week on the show, we start looking at some teams. Like, take the whole like this is obviously needs to be a deep draft people conversation, and then maybe next week it becomes like we zoom out a little bit more, and it becomes like, okay, now this is what the teams look like and who looks different, and how do we utilize these people? And I'm interested selfishly, I'm going on a fantasy show tonight, and I have to flip it and just start looking at these guys through a fantasy prism, which I haven't been doing for this entire draft process. And I can't wait to just even start thinking about it from that standpoint, which I have not. And I bet you certain names are going to rise, and I'm going to go, oh my God, I love that guy. And we haven't even talked about him. So lots of stuff to look forward here on the SumerSports show as we head into just a real meat, the deep off season. We're going to have to come up with things to talk about, and this is the right place to come to because we've got a lot of the data that will support some conversations that are outside just teams are in mini camp and getting ready for training camp. Sam Bruchhaus, I'm Lindsay Rhodes. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here. And I hope that you feel like the draft went well for your team. Send us your thoughts on your favorite drafts so that we know moving forward who you liked and why. And we'll see you again next Tuesday.